Me and my girlfriend were cleaning guns. I didn't know it was loaded, and I shot her. That's what that man, the defendant, told the 911 operator when he called in to report the shooting. I was cleaning the guns. We were pointing them at each other. She said, "I want you to teach me how to use them." We were pointing them at each other, and mine went off. That's what he told one of the first responding officers who arrived on the scene after that officer walked into the residence and saw Polina Wright seated at a dining room table in a chair with a gunshot wound to the center of her forehead. I go to dry fire the rifle. I dry fired it the first time, and the second time it went off. After I dry fired it the first time, I reset the trigger, which loaded around in the chamber. I forgot the magazine was in when I fired the second time. That's what the defendant told Detective Kyle Kern of the Ocala Police Department during a formal interview about how he, assuming a firearm was unloaded, pointed at the victim and pulled the trigger. And that intentional act, that decision to pull the trigger, caused a projectile to travel down the barrel of a rifle, strike the victim in the forehead, travel through her brain, exited the back of her skull, and lodge itself in the kitchen wall directly behind her head. Ladies and gentlemen, that's why we're here, and that's why the defendant is charged with manslaughter. During the course of this trial, you are not going to hear any evidence that the defendant planned to kill the victim, or that he acted with some premeditated design, or that he even intended to kill the victim. That's why he's not charged with first-degree murder. During the course of this trial, you are not going to hear any evidence that the night this all happened, the victim and the defendant were engaged in some big argument or some big fight, or that the defendant was acting with hatred, spite, ill will, or evil intent towards the victim. That's why he's not charged with second-degree murder. The evidence you're going to hear is that the defendant, assuming a rifle was unloaded, pointed it at another person and intentionally pulled the trigger, causing the death of Polina Wright. That's why he's charged with manslaughter. Polina Wright was a 25-year-old young lady. She was the daughter of John and Karen Wright. And the evidence that you're going to hear is that on September 19th, 2024, the defendant, Leslie Boileau, who at the time was an active Marion County Sheriff deputy, and his girlfriend, Polina Wright, went to dinner. The evening started like any other ordinary, normal evening. They went to dinner. They each had 3 margaritas at a Mexican restaurant for dinner. They got home, and the defendant found that some items that he ordered from Amazon had arrived at the house, some gun cleaning supplies. They put the football game on, and they settled in for what was supposed to be an ordinary evening. But ladies and gentlemen, that evening ended in a way that was anything but ordinary. It ended in a way that should never have happened. It ended in Polina Wright's death. At a little before 11 o'clock that evening, the 911 call center in Marion County received a call from the defendant to report this shooting. He told the call taker he and his girlfriend were cleaning guns. He didn't know his was loaded, and he shot her. He said, "I knew I shouldn't have been doing this." Ocala police officers arrived on scene pretty quickly. They went inside the house, and there they found Polina Wright sitting in a chair at a dining room table. She had a gunshot wound to her forehead, dead center of her forehead. She was naked. There was a blanket covering the bottom half of her body. And she was sitting at that dining room table. Officers immediately noticed a large pool of blood at her feet and some blood spatter as a result of a gunshot wound around the area. The defendant quickly told the officers that she had a gun in her lap. So one of the officers, Officer McCurry, walked over and found that gun in the victim's lap, picked the gun up and put it on the dining room table. That gun was unloaded and there was no magazine in it. The officers also noticed at the dining room table at which the victim was sitting various other items. They noticed some gun cleaning supplies, and they noticed an AR-style rifle sitting on that table, along with some loaded magazines, some boxes of ammunition, some live rounds, and things like that. In order to provide the officers some room to work, you'll hear that the officers took the table at which she was seated and kind of shifted it over to the wall and moved some of the chairs around. And when the officers first arrived, they walked in and they saw the defendant was behind the victim, holding the victim's head stationary. One of the officers switched positions and took control of the victim's head to keep it stationary, and the defendant was escorted outside. Once the scene was cleared and determined that there are no other people inside the house or no other threats, the emergency medical personnel came in. They quickly assessed the victim and unfortunately determined that she was not capable of being saved, and they declared her deceased. Once that confirmation was made, the officers took Polina Wright's body, gently laid her on the ground, and covered her body up with a blanket. Crime scene investigators came into the scene, and they started doing what they do. They started taking photographs of various things. They started documenting the evidence and collecting certain pieces of evidence. They collected that Glock 9mm handgun that was in the victim's lap, which ended up being the defendant's service pistol. They collected that AR-style rifle that was sitting on the dining room table at which the victim sat, as well as the boxes of ammunition, the live rounds, the loaded magazines, and things like that. They also located, near the feet of where the victim was originally seated, a fired or a spent shell casing. They located a hole in the kitchen wall directly behind the victim's head where she was seated. They eventually dug out the drywall of that wall, and they found the projectile that caused the victim's death. They collected those items, and the projectile on the wall, the spent casing on the ground, as well as that AR-style rifle, were all sent to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement for scientific analysis. A Florida Department of Law Enforcement firearms analyst examined those items and determined that the projectile in the wall, the casing on the ground, were both fired from that AR-style rifle that was on the table. Now, I said a few minutes ago that the defendant was escorted out of the house when the officers arrived. And when he was outside, he made some statements about what happened. He told the officer, "I was cleaning the guns. We were pointing them at each other. She said, 'I want you to teach me how to use them.' We were pointing them at each other, and mine went off." He admitted to being the one holding that AR-style rifle at the time it was fired and at the time the victim was killed. He said, "I know it looks really bad." And during the next several minutes on scene, he continued to make statements such as, "I know better. I know better. This should not have been happening. I should not have let this happen." The defendant was later transported to the Ocala Police Department, where a more formal interview was done with Detective Kyle Kern. The detective read the defendant what are called Miranda warnings. He told the defendant, "You have the right to remain silent. You have the right to an attorney. Anything you say can be used against you." Those things that we all know. And the defendant was well aware of those rights. He was a deputy sheriff. But nonetheless, Detective Kern read those rights to the defendant, and the defendant agreed to speak. The defendant told Detective Kern that he and the victim were dating, that it was his house, and that night they went to dinner at a Mexican place. He told the detective that they each had 3 margaritas with dinner, and they got home, put the football game on, settled in, and then he saw that Amazon had delivered the gun cleaning supplies that he had ordered. He told the detective that the victim, when they got home, took off her clothes, which she occasionally did when they were at home in the privacy of their own home, and they sat at that dining room table across from each other. And the defendant started cleaning the guns with his new gun cleaning supplies that he got from Amazon. He told the detective that he was cleaning that AR-style rifle, and you're going to hear that that AR-style rifle had a sight on it that you look through, and it was a red dot sight, meaning that when you look through the sight, there's a red dot that is projected onto the target exactly where that bullet will go when the gun is fired. It's similar to a laser sight. The only difference is in a laser sight, when you activate the laser, everyone can see where that laser is, kind of like a pointer. But with a red dot, you look through the sight in order to see that red dot where the gun is going to fire and where the target is. The defendant said he finished cleaning the AR-style rifle, and he put the magazine, the loaded magazine, in that rifle. And at about that time, the victim, Ms. Wright, reached and grabbed the 9mm Glock handgun. The defendant said He then reached over, took the 9mm from the victim, unloaded it, took the magazine out, and gave it back to her. The defendant admitted then he took possession of that rifle, that AR rifle, now with the magazine inserted in it, and he said that they began to do what he called training exercises. They began to dry fire the weapons. By dry fire, what he explained was that when an unloaded weapon, you pull the trigger, it clicks because there's nothing in it to shoot. And if you reset that trigger and charge that weapon, if it's unloaded, the gun will click, and we pull the trigger and it clicks again. So what the defendant indicated that he did was he dry fired that AR-style rifle, reset the trigger by charging the gun, which then loaded a round into the chamber. And while that firearm was pointed at the victim, he pulled the trigger the second time. That decision, that intentional act of pulling the trigger the second time, now with a loaded firearm, caused that firearm to discharge and kill the victim. Detective Kern asked the defendant, so during this training that you're describing, you were pointing the guns at each other? And the defendant said, yeah. I know I shouldn't have been doing that. That should not have happened. This is my fault. Polina Wright's body was transported to the medical examiner's office where an autopsy was conducted by Dr. Rachel Lang, a medical examiner. She's a medical doctor. And Dr. Lang will come in and she's going to explain to you the injuries that she saw on Polina Wright. And the primary injury that she saw was the gunshot wound to her forehead. And Dr. Lang will tell you that it was an entrance wound to the center of her forehead. The projectile traveled almost a directly horizontal path and exited the back of her skull. She'll also tell you about a second injury that she saw on Polina Wright. And that second injury was to the index finger of her right hand. She'll tell you that a projectile entered the outside of her right hand, exited the palm side of the finger on the right hand. And since there was one projectile located, one casing located, only evidence of one shot being fired, that the evidence is consistent with the victim's hand being positioned in front of her face in some manner, such that the projectile, when fired from the AR-style rifle, entered the back of her hand, exited the palm side of her finger, and then hit the center of her forehead as it traveled on a horizontal plane. Dr. Lang will explain that she determined that the cause of the victim's death in this case was a gunshot wound to her head, and she determined that this was a homicide. At the end of this case, ladies and gentlemen, the evidence will show that the defendant was armed with an AR-style rifle, that he pointed it at the victim's forehead and intentionally pulled the trigger. That caused the death of Polina Wright. The evidence is going to show that the defendant broke the number one rule of fire safety: never point a gun at somebody unless you're going to use it. At the end of this case, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to ask you to find the defendant guilty of manslaughter. And we're going to ask you to do that because that's what the evidence will have proven beyond any reasonable doubt. And that's what the law will require. Thank you so much for your time.
Mr. Taddy, do you care to make an opening statement?
I do. May it please the court?
Yes, sir.
Good morning. What the 911 operator actually heard first is I just had an accidental discharge. And the operator wasn't sure exactly what the caller said. And he said, accidental discharge, in a very stressed, frantic voice. Those were Dale Boileau's first words to the 911 operator while holding Polina, his girlfriend of 2 years, seconds after he accidentally shot her. The charge, the entire case, is based on the circumstances surrounding how Polina Wright was shot. And the evidence in this case will make it fairly clear that the only reason that the law enforcement officers who investigated this case and the prosecutors who filed it would know anything at all about what happened is because Dale told. Nothing, you will see, that Dale told them was inconsistent with the evidence they found. And the evidence will show that he consistently told them that it was an accident. But the state says he said they were pointing the guns at each other. The first time he said that was moments after being rushed out of the house in the company of 6 or 7 uniformed Ocala police officers and standing out in the yard while he was nearly hyperventilating, crying, screaming Polina's name, throwing himself on the ground. In the midst of that, what happened, man? We were pointing the guns at each other and it went off. Not one of them asked him to describe that. What does that mean? Pointing the guns at each other and it went off. Nobody asked him. More importantly, nobody ever asked him how the shooting actually occurred. He told Detective Kern, when Kern began a sentence with, so you were pointing the guns at each other, Dale actually stopped him and said, no, in the general direction. See, they were seated across the table from each other. So the weapons were going to be going in the direction of the person across the table. He did not ever acknowledge playing some game where they were pointing guns at each other. And he never said he pointed the rifle at Polina and intentionally pulled the trigger. He never said that. And the state says they had some alcohol that night. The evidence will actually show that Dale had been with Polina all day. They both had a day off, and they chose to spend it together. They'd been shopping. They went out for lunch. And then later in the evening, they went to one of their favorite places for dinner, a Mexican restaurant not far from Dale's house. And they ordered food, and they ordered some drinks. Happy hour margaritas. It cost $4.49 each. Probably less than a glass of tea. The evidence will show there was no other alcohol consumed by either Polina or Dale that day. They didn't have alcohol at lunch. There was no alcohol out in the house that they had after coming home from dinner. And you're going to see the pictures. There's a can. It's like green tea that Polina was drinking. But no other alcohol containers anywhere in the house. And they were home for nearly 2.5 hours before this incident occurred. The evidence will show that alcohol was really not a factor in what happened that night. State says he pulled the trigger while pointing the weapon at the victim. But they will present absolutely no evidence that will tell you exactly what was going on at the point that trigger was pulled. And they can't, because no one asked him. The evidence will show a detective first spoke to Dale about 2.5 hours after the police arrived at his home. The detective first spoke to him the first time after Dale had been in the interview room in a metal chair for over an hour. Detective walked in, sat down, spoke with Dale for 16 minutes and 13 seconds, and then he got up and left. About 4.5 hours later, he came back again. And the second time, he spoke with Dale for 11 minutes and 13 seconds, and then left the room again. And then about 1.5 hours after that, the detective came back in the room with an evidence technician, had her photograph Mr. Boileau and take his clothes, and then told him he was being placed under arrest without bothering to talk to him again. He was interviewed for a total of 27 minutes and 26 seconds. And he was in that interview room for over 8 hours. From midnight until nearly 9 o'clock the next morning. But they still will be unable to give you any evidence that explains what happened when the trigger was pulled, because they didn't ask. So when the evidence bringers over there rest their case and sit down, you are not going to know exactly how Polina Wright was shot. You're not. There's nothing in the evidence they're going to present that's going to answer that question, because they didn't ask. After they've finished, and I've had a chance to present evidence, and I rest my case and sit down, you're going to know exactly what happened at the moment Polina Wright was killed. Exactly how this horrible, tragic accident actually happened. An accident that has destroyed 2 families, and that has haunted Dale Boileau since it happened, and basically destroyed his life. And cost him the love of his young life. Please pay attention to the evidence. I know you will. Both the witnesses who testify and the exhibits and photographs and the other things that you will be asked to look at. Some of it may be unpleasant to look at. Dead bodies are not pleasant to look at. Okay? But pay attention. And I'll come back at the end. And if I'm wrong about them not being able to tell you how this happened, you tell me about it. Thank you.